Hi, our weekly Wednesday meetups on Clubhouse have been amazing. We've been talking about smart cities over the past few weeks. In this video, I will be giving you a recap of our last discussion. I kicked off the discussion about Neom, the super city located in northeastern Saudi Arabia. They're planning on building the city, and they shared that they're focused on health and inclusion. I asked if people could share through a pull to refresh or PTR in Clubhouse speak about the books that they're currently reading. I'm reading the book called Caste, written by Isabel Wilkerson, and asked if the group saw any parallels about what we can understand about how behaviors are emulated due to inherited conversations, particularly in cities. I asked a question about how those inherited conversations and behaviors might affect technology and smart cities themselves. So, some interesting topics came about. I'm going to summarize them in a couple categories. Number one is resiliency. Number two is human-centered design. And number three is healthy buildings and how they might be documented through city information modeling. One of the main topics, like I said, we began to talk about was resiliency. When you see what happened in Texas a couple weeks ago and the power outages took place and people had to deal with winter weather, questions came up about, can we have a truly connected smart city when there are separate standards from the rest of the state or a nation? We had a conversation about what resiliency is. We discussed one definition being that it's the ability to adapt to certain changes. And another one was, can you bounce back more easily from disasters you nominally planned for or not planned for? But the recent news of both Texas and Mississippi opening back up, in particular Texas, with no mask mandates, we'll have to see how resilient that state particularly is, and if there'll be another spike that happens, any other potential impacts that might be caused by this. We'll keep our eyes open, won't we? We covered that it is challenging to manage resources unless we're tracking accessibility and utilization. And if there's a way to manage our resources better, where the city could be making sure to collect that data and understand the community needs, not just what's good for one group, location, or demographic, but cities should be able to accommodate for all different kinds of people and their needs. We talked about company plans for resiliency. As an example, we talked about redundancy for power and internet that's typically used in companies. And that's one way to plan for resiliency. Another way that was described was planning based upon probability, based upon historical data, and how likely you're able to encounter a disaster. Based on historical data and how likely you are to encounter a disaster. How can we put potential measures in place and supply the likelihood, whether there'll be funding or infrastructure, etc. We also mentioned we could use data and have resiliency through distributed ledger technologies, for example, blockchain. With these conversations, a focus popped up regularly throughout about human-centric design, the concern about the citizen first. A great point came up about how government should be on board to take on an understanding of what their goals are, but also their people's goals. Understanding the next levels of how they might build infrastructure and allow citizens and visitors to have feedback about what that experience might be like, what that might cause as far as benefits for a city. We talked about how the citizens are the stakeholders and there needs to be that feedback loop. In order for that to happen, there's a need to educate the broader community about the goals of a government. And it should be a true priority in order to provide them a mechanism for feedback in order to gather those opinions so that a city can know what to focus on. There is a need to create more transparency if people are not getting proper education around policies and even desired behaviors for the community that lives in that city and for that city to ultimately thrive. It's a combination between parties of the city and feedback from the citizens that should drive urban planning so that citizens are ultimately supported. Our next major topic was healthy buildings and city information modeling. We talked about how that ties directly to urban planning and how it should support a healthy lifestyle for the citizens. We talked about how more outdoor space can be used to encourage outside activities. We talked about how the pandemic has caused more people to move away from cities, living in rural or suburban areas just to escape the pandemic, simply because many feel there is, quote, no need to work in an office. And even if we do open offices up, many will likely be in a hybrid model. We talked about the value of ensuring the business of building management takes priority and that the entire life cycle of building management is the focus. People value healthy building standards like WELL and LEED. We talked about how we have this opportunity to reduce our carbon footprint in current buildings that we own and operate. This would allow for physical spaces to support physical health and mental health. And the management of those buildings should be supported by virtual design systems, 3D modeling, virtual reality, and similarly, these things can be extended out for a city, i.e. city information modeling. So we also talked about a couple topics that we want to dig into in the future. One came up that's really interesting, NFTs, or non-fungible tokens for social good and advocacy. We talked about CLTs, cross-laminated timber, and standardizations for design, particularly BIM. We talked about Kobe and evolutions of that. Last but not least, we talked about sidewalk labs. What happened? Why did it get pulled back? So these are some topics that we're going to be digging into in the future. Now, I really enjoy our conversations every Wednesday, and I want you to participate in them too. Don't you want to join? We are meeting weekly, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern, to discuss smart cities and to dig deep in these topics and more. Follow the link to Clubhouse below.